Thank you for your prayers for the next week or so out in Kampala. It will not all be sacrifice and service. In fact, some of the team have already left and right now are on safari. So, making the most of the whole trip. The psalm this morning that we're going to look at, we will not fully understand unless we understand the context in which it was written. David was the author, and he actually wrote this at one of the low points. And as you will see in a minute, we're talking serious low points of his life. His son Absalom and he have always had a tricky relationship. But one imagines that even at its lowest points, David never imagined that tricky relationship would transfer into coup d'etat, which is exactly what Absalom did. He started with a charm offensive with people. The king, David, didn't have systems in place to really help the people with judgments, decisions, sort of regulating affairs in the nation in the sort of way that he should. So Absalom, smart guy, good-looking guy, arrives early every morning just outside the gate to Jerusalem. And when people come and they see the prince, they bow down. He says, no, get up. And he kisses them and he says, can I help you? And so they unburden their hearts to him and he listens to them, he makes suggestions, but he always finishes with this: if only I were the king, then we could really get some things done around here. And so over time, and you can read all about this in 2 Samuel 15 through 18, those 4 chapters, and the writer of those books says that as a result of that, he won the hearts of the people. He then asked permission to go to Hebron, outside Jerusalem, to worship. But actually, on his way, he just gathered an army and marched on Jerusalem. David, his father, is totally taken unawares by this and literally has time to gather belongings and to head out of the city as fast as he can. And Absalom is surrounded by some pretty nasty pieces of work in terms of advisors. He gets into Jerusalem, it is a bloodless coup. He gets to the palace and they say, look, what's important now, O king, is that you show there's some serious clear water between you and your father. That nobody will confuse the fact or think that there could be possible alliances in the future. Here's what we suggest you do. Erect a tent on the top of the palace in full view of the whole of Jerusalem, and then take your father's concubines one by one. Make love to them. So that, to quote the narrative, so that everyone will know that you are now a stench in the nostrils of your father. I was about to say you can imagine how David felt. You probably can't imagine. At least most of us cannot imagine how David would feel as he is leading his people out of Jerusalem. He's weeping, they're weeping. And he, of course, is busy having to process a whole load of emotion all at once. The son that was difficult has now become the son that hates his father. The son who intends apparently to kill his father. Not only is that all the difficulty of processing all that emotion, there's also the sheer humiliation of the fact that he, the great warrior, the one who has led Israel to its heights, never were the boundaries of Israel greater than under David's leadership. He has now been humiliated by his son. As a servant leader, he would have cared for his people. He would have been worrying about the nation. The welfare of the nation reflected on the glory of his God. So he's got personal issues, he has got national concerns, and he's got, if you like, spiritual concerns. There's this whole flood of emotion. As Ange said, we are looking this week at the question of loss. We're taking different psalms during this series. We're looking at the emotions that the psalmist speaks of, and we're saying, what do we do when we feel like that? And how do we take that and turn that to worship? And whilst none of us will have exactly the experience of David, and most of us will probably not have anything as extreme, often the extreme story or picture is the one from which it's most easy to draw principles that can apply to the whole of our lives. One of the truths of life is that life involves loss. from time to time, you will have things taken from you. The older you are here in this room, the more likely you are to know that that is true. Loss comes in all shapes and sizes. Some of you new to London will right now be feeling the loss of family or friends. Others of you who've been in London a while have the same emotions, but that's not because you've just left friends, but because they've just left you. And they've headed somewhere else in the world. And the joy of London life with a community has suddenly somewhat fallen apart around you. And emotion goes along with that. Maybe loss for you has involved a change of job. Maybe a change which you didn't get much say in. Or maybe one where you simply miss the boss who believed in you or the project that you loved being part of. Maybe you have been overlooked for promotion or simply put in a sideways move while others have been elevated above you. Or maybe for you, loss has been in your life the death of a parent, the breakup of a family, or the end of a relationship that you have been in. Whatever loss has been for you, loss is a tricky thing to navigate. It throws up feelings that we're neither expecting or necessarily know what to do with. Feelings sometimes which make us wonder whether we're even followers of God or not. How could I be feeling this way? And what's great about the psalm that we're going to look at today is it's like a road map. It helps us navigate these tricky, choppy waters. And it also is not only a road map, but it ends with an element of hope. Here's the deal with loss. Loss is difficult to handle, but as we follow the advice of the psalmist and find our way through it, loss always ends or results in new opportunities and new hope. And it's important, you see, that we find our way through so we get to that point rather than are left over the long term in a place of loss. So this morning's going to be a really practical sermon, which is, I guess, what we should expect when we're in the wisdom books. 5 wisdom books in the Old Testament: Job, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Job, and Song of Solomon. Between them, they show us how to live the whole of life. Because the assumption of those writers, Solomon, David, and others, is that if this faith is really real, it should make a difference in the way that we live. So it's a very practical sermon because others should be able to look at people of faith and say they live their lives well. And I hope that this will help us to do that. So, with no further ado, let's turn to Psalm chapter 6 and let's have a read. And I'm just going to be able to put some markers in the sand this morning. I'm not going to be able to look at every element of this psalm. We'll do our best. Psalm 6, verse 1, David writing, "O Lord, don't rebuke me in your anger or discipline me in your wrath. Be merciful to me, Lord, for I am faint. O Lord, heal me. My bones are in agony." If you're experiencing loss at the moment, this is a great psalm to use as a basis of prayer. It will take you places you might not go otherwise. How my soul is in anguish. Verse 3, "How long, O Lord, how long?" Anyone ever been through grief and wondered, is this ever going to end? That's how David feels right now. How long? "Turn, O Lord, and deliver me. Save me because of your unfailing love. No one remembers you when he is dead. Who praises you from the grave? I am worn out from groaning. All night long I flood my bed with weeping and drench my couch with tears. My eyes grow weak with sorrow. They fail because of all my foes. Away from me, all you who do evil." You'll see, and we'll look at this. See how after all the anguish, tears all night, confidence is starting to return towards the end of the psalm. And so he says, "Away from me, all you who do evil. For the Lord has heard my weeping." This grief has had some effect. "The Lord has heard my cry for mercy. The Lord accepts my prayer. All my enemies will be ashamed and dismayed. They will turn back in sudden disgrace." What can we learn? What pointers does this psalm provide for us, either in the loss that we have experienced, the loss maybe we're currently experiencing, or the loss that I'm afraid all of us will experience from time to time as we live our lives. Number one, here's something that I think David has already done, is that David has acknowledged the loss. You see, when we start with loss, or when we experience loss, often our bodies, our minds cannot simply come to terms with the fact. We find ourselves thinking things like, surely this can't have happened. And that is a natural experience as the mind and the body is trying to adjust to the fact that something significant has changed in our lives. One father who lost his son last year said that for the first month of grieving, he expected his son to walk through the door every day. Now, it wasn't that he didn't know his son was dead. He'd seen the body. He'd held his dead son in his arms. It was rather a natural part of the process of trying to come to terms with a new reality. And we need to be patient during this period. We need to be patient, but also keep telling ourselves the truth, acknowledging the reality that is now life. I think David has clearly done this already. I mean, when we read this psalm, it is intense and emotional and suggests, therefore, he's clear. That if you said to him, David, what are you weeping about? He would say, my son has humiliated me, he's stolen from me, and he intends to murder me. David had clearly, by this point in time, acknowledged his loss. And this is the place that we have to start. You see, grief is a powerful tool for us. And sometimes, and in this world where comfort is often our focus, we forget that pain can be good for us. Pain can bring healing. My father is in his late 70s. He's done a lot of running, sport, and walking in his life, and basically has lost all the cartilage in both his knees. So he decided if he was going to live any sort of quality of life, it was worth having an operation where they opened up his knee, took out anything that was left, and inserted porcelain, a mixture of porcelain and metal into the kneecap in order to enable him to walk again. So he's just had the operation. So I go down last week to just check the aged P's are okay. Well, you should see my father's leg at this point in time. I mean, it's only been operated on there, but just about every part of it is black and blue and swollen. I mean, looking at it, you don't think that pain was good. You think, but I helped him down the stairs. It was his first time up and down the stairs since the operation. And as he came down the stairs, he said, he said, that knee is already better than it has been for years. Pain sometimes is good for you. Grief is good. And it starts by, rather than denying the reality of what's happened, by acknowledging that reality and by facing up to it. So for David, he couldn't hide from what was happening. Unquestionably, it was devastating for him. But it seems that he instinctively knew that he couldn't allow the demands of the moment, even the military needs, the care for others, to stop him from facing things. And I want to suggest, neither can we. If we do not acknowledge our loss, not only do we fail to start to progress, but something else happens. It stops us moving on and building new relationships, new progress in our career or whatever. Let me just give you one example of this. George Kohlreiser, amongst other things, clinical psychologist, fascinated with people. George says, and I've met him a couple of times, he says that when he's bored at an airport, he wanders around the airport looking for the strangest person that he can find, and he sits down to talk with them. Because he says, people just fascinate me so much. I want to know what's happened in their lives which has left them like this. So he tells a story back that's got nothing to do with the sermon at all. Just thought you might be interested. back to grief, George illustrates this question of if we do not acknowledge the pain, if we do not acknowledge the situation, we will not move on. With the story of a couple who came to see him after 53 years' marriage. At their golden wedding anniversary, after 50 years, their marriage for the first time started to run into trouble. Why? Because till that point in time, they had never acknowledged that one day they would lose one another. That one day one of them would live and one of them would not. And this was like, for them, their secret burden. And they started, once it got to 50 years and they started to think there can't be too much longer left, they started fighting as to who would die first. They even agreed a suicide pact and on several occasions came within minutes of taking both their lives. The real cause of their arguments, they had not faced the fact that one day they would have to let each other go. So they go to see George and he helps them through that process, accepting the fact that they would not be with one another forever and expressing the pain of that reality. George said to the wife, he said, "How long is it going to take you to grieve the fact that you will not be with your husband forever?" She said, "I need at least another 53 years. He said, "Well, you'd better get going with it now then." As a result, though, of that process, each additional minute of their marriage became a gift rather than a loss, and they were able to experience the joy of really connecting again. Acknowledgement of reality helped them to move forward. And remember, acknowledging loss and pain is not a lack of faith. It's not a lack of faith, and David, as a leader, seemed to think that it was okay for him to grieve without it undermining his leadership either. The reason that I mention this is we have some trained counselors in this church, and when I realized I was preaching on loss, I thought I should drop one or two of them a note and get some help or advice. So I wrote to one or two, and here's what I got back. Here's one of the comments. They said this: "Sadly, there is a misconception that the leaders in our church have got it all together, and that any expression or season of loss or grief will be seen as a sign of weakness or a lack of faith." This counsellor then went on to say, "But don't worry, I'm correcting that misapprehension at every opportunity. Vulnerability," she went on, "is not weakness. It takes a huge amount of courage to ask for help and to show our real self in all seasons of life." David was prepared to do that. I would suggest it is advisable for all of us, whatever respective position we hold in life, or the church, to do the same. Acknowledge our needs. Secondly, David expressed his need to God. He was not foolish enough to think that he could get through this by himself. If his relationship with God was to remain authentic, then this needed to be part of the conversation. He couldn't avoid it. He couldn't compartmentalize his life. Grief and loss over here, but with God, I'm just fine. Glory, hallelujah. David wasn't like that. He was prepared to allow God in on the mess of his life. He tells God how he's feeling. Verse 3, "My soul is in anguish." Typical emotions that we experience when we are going through loss. Humiliation, possibly David did. Anger, sadness, fear, depression can all be involved. Something of that is what David's expressing as he says, "My soul is in anguish." And then he goes on, expressing that emotion. So he's worn out from groaning, all night weeping in verse 6. So much weeping that his eyes have grown weak as a result. Remember, to grieve as a Christian does not mean that we're always singing songs of triumph and victory. I remember one friend of ours who actually came to live with us for a while after he lost his wife unexpectedly in the early years of their marriage. And somebody else commenting on him, they said he's doing very well at the moment, doing very badly. And what they meant was he's been prepared to go through this process that David's going through. And he wasn't holding back on that. Many of us know the remarkable church leader Rick Warren, who lost his son in a suicide last year. Rick said this. He says, "I've cried every day since Matthew has died." He goes on and says this. "When I swallow my emotions, my stomach keeps score. If I don't talk it out with my wife, to God, to friends, then I'm going to take it out on my body." In other words, unexpressed emotion can numb us into not feeling. It can create ill health, anger issues, bitterness, resentment, and a withdrawal from God. So we start by acknowledging the reality. Then in our relationship with God, as well as, well, we'll get to that. In our relationship with God, we express those feelings. Again, this is important. And if we don't do that, it's hard to move on. One more example from George Colreiser. George tells the story of a little girl, 9-year-old girl called Hannah, who was in a farming family, and her father had given her a pet pig. It was the runt of the litter, who Hannah loved. She carried it, she cared for it, she caused it to live, and she got home. But she got home from school one day to find that her father had killed her pig. And by the time George met her, this little girl was in hospital with a lump in her throat, which meant that she hadn't eaten for a month, and no medic could diagnose the cause of the lump. For 5 days after the pig was killed, Hannah had to walk past this animal every day on the way to school as the carcass hung in the shed. On the 5th day, she got back that evening and found her father had cooked the pig and tried to force feed her the food, with her brothers laughing at her and her mother saying nothing. It was only when the doctor and Colreiser helped the little girl tell the story, process the emotion, which took about 45 minutes of anger followed by tears, that then within half an hour after that she took her first solids, and within 2 days the lump had disappeared entirely. Grief can be therapeutic in many different ways, including literally on our physical body. And so David expresses his emotion before God, and then he asks God for his healing. And he prays 3 prayers. Firstly, be merciful to me. It's good to know that our God is full of mercy. Not only is he full of mercy, but in the figure of Jesus, he has experienced every form of loss. He lost his friends, his home comforts, his dignity, any sense of the law protecting him, his physical comfort, and his relationship with the Father. He was stripped of everything. We can come to him and ask him for mercy, and he understands what we're going through. And David says, "O Lord, heal me." He takes our pain. That's one of the things that happens at the cross. He takes our lawlessness, he takes our ignorance, he takes our foolishness, he takes our sin, but he also takes our pain. And the truth is, you cannot receive anything new if you are holding something else in your hands. And so we literally can give our pain to God. And on the cross, he has taken all the pain that the world had ever experienced to that point, and all the pain to come. And your pain can go there. That you would find the resurrection power of Jesus in your heart and life instead. And as we noticed in verse 3 already, David said, "How long?" Anyone who's grieved knows it takes longer than you want it to, and longer than you expect. So David grieved before God, but we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking this is just an individual thing. If we were to read 2 Samuel 15 through 18, we'd find he also grieved with others. Here's what it says in 15:30. David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head too covered, and he was barefoot, and all the people with him covered their heads too, and were weeping as they went. Grief is meant to be done in community, which is one of the wonderful things about a church, is it should give us a context where we bear with one another's burdens and we mourn with one another, as well as rejoicing with one another. It's one of the reasons I encourage everyone to be involved in relationship, not just in attendance. And our connect groups and our life groups and our social action projects provide a way of connecting with one another. And my encouragement is that we do not wait until we need others to connect with others, because typically it's too late at that point. Most people don't want to connect with someone when they're hurting unless they've built some relationship already. My encouragement is we build relationship so that we can both care for others and have others care for us. The biggest thing, I'm told, when you're going through serious grief is loneliness. And therefore, to mourn with those that mourn means we can open up our lives and sometimes even our homes to one another. Philip and I have done this on several occasions. It's been a joy and a privilege to do it. And often it has simply been, we've been told, knowing there's somebody else in the house. It's often been no more than that. And of course, as we care for one another, we can help each other get and keep our heads straight when the emotion is doing funny things to us. You should know, this autumn we will also do a grief share course here. We did one before, which is a group course for those who've been through bereavement. We'll be telling you more about that. It's a 12-week or a 14-week course. There's a whole group of people now at Christchurch who've done it. And if I can say this in the right way, they loved the process. And it was extremely helpful and extremely therapeutic for them. We want to do that as resources enable us on a regular basis. And so more details of that to come. So David starts by saying, here's the new reality. He then goes to God and acknowledges his pain and asks for healing. He processes it with a wider community, and finally, he anticipates the opportunity to start again. We've looked at this already, or I mentioned it as we read verse 8. Away from me, all you who do evil. Oh, that's new. Verse 10, all my enemies will be ashamed and destroyed. They will turn back in sudden disgrace. David's suddenly seeing a fresh way that he could both become king again and use his kingship in the right ways. Remember, any of you go through grief at the moment or who've become stuck in your grief, remember this, if you forget everything else, the other side of grief, there are new opportunities. The other side of grief, there is fresh life. Rick Warren says this. He says, your greatest life calling will come from your greatest sense of loss. Your greatest life calling will come from your greatest sense of loss. I wonder what that means and how that might work out for you. Shortly after the start of Christchurch London, many of us at the time remember Tom Apps Rees-Price being stabbed to death. He was a lawyer, worked just down the road from here. And he'd just come out of one of the tube stations. He was on his way home late one evening. And he was killed for the sake of a mobile phone, an Oyster card, and £20 in cash. Next to his body, blood-stained documents were found with the wedding plans that he was making with his fiancée to be married 9 months later. Now, his parents, who are Christians, knew at that point in time that this is one of the points where their faith really did need to come into action. They had just retired. They were looking forward to a whole new lease of life, and they suddenly found they'd lost their son. Here's what Tom's father said. There is no sense in wallowing. And they've been processing their grief, but he gets to the point where he says there's no sense in wallowing, so instead we decided to set about trying to stop this happening to other people's sons. They went to visit the headmaster of the school which the two young men who had killed their son were at. The headmaster described their meeting like this. He said, they came up to my room and asked me about the boys. As soon as I started talking about him, they started crying. I remember going to the pub that evening and telling friends that I had met the most unbelievable people in the world. You just don't think the world deserves people like that. You remember the writer to the Hebrews? And the world is not worthy of them. They have shown, he said, extraordinary redemption and forgiveness. As a result, they started a charity. that's raised and given away £1.5 million, including a significant amount to the very school that the young men who took their son's life came from. While this is an extraordinary response, it's not actually that unusual a response. Loss often does that to people. It leads them to new pathways, unexpected pathways, but new leases of life and new opportunities to contribute as a result. You would have thought that losing a father when you're very young is going to set you back in life. But over 50% of British prime ministers lost their fathers when they were young. And somehow they turned what would have appeared to be a disadvantage into an advantage in their lives as a result. I want to finish here. How about you? How about you? How does this psalm speak to you at this point in time? Have you acknowledged your loss? And I should say, we've dwelt on major loss. Minor loss happens every day. You lose your gadgets. You lose a night's sleep. A weekend is gone. And you become grumpy as a result. These same principles, moved through at much greater speed, can still be used to just make yourself nice again after you've been through that sort of process. Acknowledge your loss. Have you expressed your need to God? Have you taken your feelings and your emotions, important parts of how we are wired up? Have you asked Him for your healing? Do you have others around you with whom you can grieve? Or I should ask, are there people in most of our lives who are grieving at the moment who we should make sure we carry at this point in time? Or maybe, are you ready? Maybe the band can come up, please. Or are you ready to embrace new opportunities? You know, at the end, we're going to sing in a minute, but at the end, there will be an opportunity if you would like to receive prayer. And it may just simply be you need to make a decision this morning. I need to move things on. Or it may be that you're saying, new opportunities, David, you have got to be joking. And you'd just like someone to stand with you and pray. For that sense, as David said, my enemies will be ashamed. They will be put on the run in due course. Whatever it is, if it would help you to receive prayer this morning, then you're welcome to come to the front at the end, and the guys will be here. They'll be delighted to pray with you. Should we stand together?